Next in our series of how to design your own bridal line, here to take us from sketch to dress, is Natalie Smith from Points of Measure. This was a very detailed, helpful conversation that we had together. So Natalie, what do you do as a garment technologist? Tell us, what does that mean?
I would call myself a garment technologist because I kind of span everything from, sewing and pattern making to technical design. I would say mainly like people probably know me for technical design.
Okay. All right. Nice. I do feel like that all of that has like a little bit of overlap. I mean, I'm sure if you
Oh,
go
yeah.
work in some big place, you may just have your one little job that you do, but I feel like generally in the industry, people who do your kind of thing, they do like to have lots of overlap, you know?
Yeah, well,
So,
I mean, and I think this is a big issue that I see. There, especially when you're in school, like there really isn't a lot of education, I feel like, on the technical side, unless you do something like specifically pattern making or costume design or something like that. And so designers are coming into the industry with like no technical background. And that's where it gets really, really challenging. So there's definitely like when you get on the job, whether you're a technical designer, a designer, a merchandiser, a sourcing agent, whatever you end up being, there's so much overlap between the different things. So the more you can educate yourself on all those little different things, you don't have to be a master of everything, but as long as
mm-hmm.
you understand how does pattern making work, how is a garment sewn together, like what is a tech pack, what's inside of it, like how does the factory take what I'm giving them and make it into a garment. As long as you kind of understand those overarching concepts, I think you can pretty much do anything.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting because I have more of like a liberal arts degree background, and they make you take a smattering of everything. And so it's always so interesting to me when I see people with it's very often a job in some type of fashion design or whatever, where they're like, oh no, like I have this one thing, like I don't know how to sew, like it just seems so
Yeah.
funny that like they didn't have to learn everything, or maybe they did but they just weren't good at it and they didn't feel like they've carried it on with them, maybe, I don't know,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. It's so true. Well, when I started out in design, I was like, I was taught by my mom how to sew, and I was like, I like got the basics. Like, I'm not going to take the time to learn this. I don't want to be a seamstress. Like,
mm,
I will have a factory making my stuff. I'm not going to learn how to do this. And it's like you basically forced to, because you
yeah.
have to have like a collection at the end of the year and stuff. So I'm glad that I had such an awesome professor who basically forced me to learn proper sewing techniques, because I would definitely not be where I am today without that.
That's awesome. Where did you go to school?
I went to Seattle Pacific University.
Okay, nice. All
Yeah.
right.
It's a pretty small school over here.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we, chatted a little bit back and forth in the DMs on Instagram, and this is kind of the heart of what I wanted to get to. I was talking with you about how my background for any type of production or selling of garments or whatever would be just everything myself, doing small, just very small lines, really small runs. If I was to ever duplicate a piece, it would only be like two or three times. Most everything is bespoke or custom, or like I
Right.
said, the very small lines. And then the next season, I would be doing something new again, anyways.
Right.
So, and I feel like there's a lot of small time designers and bridal sewists that do that kind of thing.
Hmm.
But I guess I feel like this is kind of the thing of like, when you get into something that you want to be able to scale, you look back at the things that have been working and you're like, yeah, that's not going to work. Like it works just fine for me. Like my, rudimentary patterns that I make work just fine for me.
Right.
But there's no way I could just send them off to a sewing factory and get something back. They would be really mad at me, I'm wanting you to speak to people who are like, tech pack. Yeah, what's that?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, for
how
sure.
do I make a tech pack, and what if my tech pack is not good enough? Like, who is going to come and get me, and then, how are they going to kind of correct that or get the proper information? I've heard horror stories of, so-called air quotes designers, and, they designed this wonderful, wedding gown or whatever, and then they forgot, like, to say if is it going to have a zipper? Like, they completely forgot.
Yeah.
Like, a person has to get into this, which seems silly, but I mean, you don't realize what you forget, right?
Yeah. I mean, it
So,
takes time to, learn all the ins and outs of things, and of course you're going to miss stuff here and there.
yeah.
I think the first thing that I notice a lot of times when people reach out to me, or my audience members or my students or whoever, they think that they have to have the pattern made, and they think that that's like the most important part. But when it comes to actually like doing like ready to wear, where you're sending a tech pack to a factory or something, you're not creating the pattern. And even if you have gone through pattern making and sampling, like let's say just with like a small pattern maker, and you're like, okay, let's just like figure this out together. If you go to send that pattern or that sample to the factory, they're not going to accept it. They want to start over from scratch, start over from a tech pack, and do things the right way.
Right.
And that's because they on their end are having to set up an entire production line, right? So the whole like sampling process is they're able to go through all the ins and outs of this, work through all the tiny little details and the small little things that you wouldn't notice, and kind of get everything set up so that when they do set it up on the production line, it's like smooth sailing, ready to go as fast as possible, making basically the most money that they can off of the project.
Sure. So, what would you say is the least amount that you could hand a sewing factory, and what is the most amount, like the highest echelon of like, wow, this person has their act together?
So there are different factories, and I've seen like more factories being open to like receiving less information, especially at first. And they're usually like smaller factories who are basically just trying to get like a client base. You could think of it that way. And they a lot of times will just accept like a drawing or something small. And the way that they're coming from it as is like, okay, this designer like, has a concept, but they really don't know anything about like the technical part of this. Like you were saying, like, does it need a zipper? What fabric is it made out of? All this other stuff. And they're like, okay, we'll just make the like decisions for them, and essentially try to make the money that we can while still providing them with what we promised. But the issue that you run into there as like a designer or technical designer or brand owner or whatever is that you'd have no control over what's happening. And it may be fine at first for the first couple pieces, but it ends up becoming like a huge issue later on. And a lot of the clients that I end up working with kind of like started out like that, or that's where they're currently at, and they're like, okay, crap, like things are not good. Like, come and fix this. It's really bad. And I would say like the most that you should be giving I would say like the standard, and what I recommend, which probably ends up being on like the most side, like the correct way to do things is to have a complete size chart with extended measurements all figured out based on your unique customer, completely customized to your customer base, providing that to the factory along with a tech pack that has a POM, a technical sketch, a BOM, and if you usually don't need to provide grading at first, but you'll need to provide it later on. And then construction details. So all of the construction and technical information that goes into like, what type of stitching do you want? What type of construction do you want for the hem? Do you want it turned? Do you want it raw? How do you want it finished? So all of that information, and then also providing them with a very, very detailed points of measure in terms of like how it is laid out. I have like a formula that I specifically use that is very specific about where the measurement starts, where it ends, which is it taken along a curve or is it taken straight, all those little details, and then a corresponding how to measure guide. So you can measure each point on the garment like a million different ways. And so you really need to have that how to measure guide so that you and your factory are both measuring the same way, because if they take those measurements and go to make a pattern out of it and they're assuming that you're taking it from the stitch versus at the seam,
Mm-hmm.
then it's going to end up being a lot different. So you really want to be clear about absolutely everything that you can be. And my kind of like rule of thumb is you want to be as specific as possible without painting your factory into a box. So you don't want to give them so many measurements that they're forced to make bad decisions, whether that's like an armhole curve or something like that. And you don't want to duplicate any information. So you want to keep like the type of zipper that you're including on the BOM page. It should not be on the construction details page. You don't want it in two places. So those are kind of like my main things. And yeah, just, trying to provide them with all of the information that they need without having to second guess things or like make certain decisions for you. Like obviously, as they are the pattern maker, they are going to have to make like some decisions about pattern shapes and things like that. But you really, as the technical designer, need to be guiding them in the appropriate way. Yeah.
So what's like a budget range if you have someone who, now for me, I know you're saying you could submit sketches, but I feel like with bridal, I cannot imagine designing anything without like extensive draping and sampling and like, actually sewing and making the thing. So I can see, the different layers. This is not a tank top,
Yeah,
It's like
yeah.
we need to
Right,
see
and
the foundations and how they
that's
all.
why, bridal companies and a lot of like high-end designers, they have their own atelier, right? Because
Yes.
the designer can go down there and drape everything and be like, okay, I want it to look like this, and then the seamstresses all work together and
Yeah.
pattern makers all work together to make it happen.
Yeah. There's
So
so
it
much.
definitely like if you have a ton of draping and stuff like that, you really have to put a lot of effort into creating the pattern from that draping so that it can be duplicated, which is
Right.
very challenging. That would obviously take like very advanced seamstresses
Right.
and pattern makers to figure out.
So what would that be like a budget range? So
I mean, something like that was like so if you had something that was like insanely draped and stuff, that would be very, very expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, probably just at minimum $20,000 for one garment.
Wow. That's
I would
amazing.
assume in terms of like if you would have to have several seamstresses and several pattern makers working together to really figure it out and having to evaluate, like, let's say you sent them a sample or something, evaluating it. So it would be like a more like hands-on versus just like sending a tech pack.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say, just in my own experience, there's always that middle section of scaling any project, right? You've got like the kind of beginner baby stages where you're just making it yourself and you're just sewing like 2 or 3 and you're selling them on Etsy or directly somehow. And then you've got like the higher end, like you were saying, where they've got their own atelier.
Yeah.
Everything is just right there at, they have investors behind them, like all their factoring is worked out. And, you've got that. And then you've got this middle section that just seems like such a challenge, for designers to scale up into.
Right. And I think sometimes it has to come from both sides, right? You can't, like, let's say you did have something that was super draped and beautiful and took all this time to create. You might have to dial that back to fit within, like, your own budget and stuff, right? So, okay, like, this whole thing is draped. Maybe we just drape the bodice, or maybe, we kind of take this essence and do it in a way that we can do it with darts or pleats or something like that.
Yeah, and I don't know I know you've been traveling a lot. Like you said, you were sick and then you were traveling and you've got your own projects, but I don't know if you saw my latest video I put up where I was comparing the Sheen dress with the Stella York gown.
Oh, no, I did not see it. I have like not been on Instagram, so I'll have to go watch that.
Okay, well, it's on YouTube, but of course I post on Instagram and stories when one comes up. So
right.
You know how that goes. If you're not there within that 24 hours, you miss the boat.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So true.
So, but it's really interesting. I kind of like let the viewer see the guts of the garments, and like the layers and how one has the overlay, the lace overlay is like hand stitched on, and the other is really just like lace fabric cut out with the pattern and sewn together, and you've got all your seams visible. And I think that is probably a perfect example of what you're talking about. This Sheen dress was like, I think it was like $29. And then the Stella York dress goes for around 1400. And it's definitely, there's so much more detail, but it shows you that I was actually surprised. I was kind of afraid that I was going to have all these people like pounce on me, for even having that dirty word, Sheen or Shein, they call it, in a video. But I was surprised. A lot of people were like, the dress is not that bad, it's fast fashion. I get it, but it was not that bad. And, I feel that way too. I feel like you could make a dress that kind of speaks to the direction you want to go in that's really not that bad. And it would be like affordable for you to actually produce,
Well, right. And that's where some of the technical stuff comes in too, right? Because then you have to have an understanding of what seams and stitches are expensive and what's not. And that's when you can, like, when you really have that full understanding of like technical design and construction and stuff, you can really start to make like educated decisions about like there are stitches and seams that look really nice and they're actually on the cheaper end. But it's just really understanding like what that is. I actually started out working at a couturier. It's called Lulu Yang. I don't know if you've heard of it. The butterfly dress, the monarch dress, is the dress that she did. So I worked under her, I guess technically, she's the owner, and got to work closely with her and stuff and see her design and all that stuff. But we also carried like ready to wear bridal as well. And so it was really interesting to compare like, couture level gowns that were being made downstairs in the atelier, versus, like a Nicole Miller dress that's being made in a factory. And them essentially being around the same price range, and just like the difference in the construction and details and stuff. It was just very eye-opening experience. You make so much more money if you do that. You like a bridal atelier that is like specifically just selling like high-end gowns or custom made gowns and stuff. Like it is a struggle. So you have to have, I think, almost, depending on how you market yourself and everything, right? But like to some extent, I think you almost have to have like that ready to wear side of things, or you're gonna sink in this climate, in this market.
But you have a YouTube channel, right?
I do. Yeah.
Okay, so tell us what that is.
So all of my social media handles, including my YouTube channel, is Points of Measure. So you can find me there on pretty much everything. I do mainly like technical design tutorials and stuff like that. Occasionally I'll talk about, other things or do kind of like crafting things and stuff like that. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And my biggest thing is just trying to, like where I came from was I feel like I really didn't learn everything I needed to know when I came out of school. And when I got on the job, it was like I learned so much. And I was so fortunate to be exposed to so many brands under kind of like one roof. And so I learned so many cool things. I'm kind of taking all of those concepts and putting it out in the world. And you're not going to learn this stuff at school, but this is what you need to know before you go into the industry.
And we are so grateful for Natalie sharing all that with us and for spending this time with us. Please drop a comment down below sharing your appreciation. Thank you again for spending time with us today. Bye.